The day an empath stops explaining, emotional intelligence and silent power. There is a specific invisible threshold that every highly sensitive, deeply empathetic person eventually reaches. It doesn't happen with a slam of a door. It doesn't arrive in a burst of outrage, nor is it marked by an ultimatum delivered in raised tones. Sighs. It happens in absolute stillness. It is the precise moment you realize you have spent years, perhaps your entire life, acting as a defense attorney for your own heart. Think about how much of your psychological bandwidth has been consumed by the exhausting art of over-explaining, rereading messages 5 times before sending them, crafting long paragraphs to clarify your intentions after a minor misunderstanding. Thoughtful, laying out the architecture of your pain to someone who is only listening to prepare their counter-argument. You over-explain because your neural architecture is wired for connection. You possess an elevated capacity for emotional attunement. You feel the micro shifts in a room, the unspoken tension, the subtle withdrawal of another person. And because you feel those shifts so acutely, your brain misinterprets miscommunication as an existential threat. You tell yourself, if I can just explain it one more time, if I can just find the precise sequence of words, they will understand me. And if they understand me, we will be safe. So you burn your daily supply of cognitive and emotional energy attempting to bridge a gap that was never caused by a lack of words. It was caused by a lack of capacity on the other side. Now, imagine what happens to your life when that pattern breaks. Imagine the sheer volume of psychological energy that returns to you the second you stop trying to manage how others perceive your truth. When an empath stops explaining, something radical happens to the mind. The chronic activation of your nervous system begins to settle. The urge to defend your right to feel, your right to set a boundary, or your right to step back simply evaporates. This isn't coldness. It isn't spite. It is the ultimate expression of emotional mastery. It is the realization that your clarity does not require another person's agreement. If you have ever felt exhausted by your own empathy, if you have ever felt like you are giving everything and constantly defending your right to exist while doing so, stay right where you are. Because what we are breaking down today will fundamentally change how you navigate your relationships, your boundaries, and your own mind. You are about to discover why your silence is not a concession of defeat, but the most formidable power you will ever possess. Empaths over-explain not out of weakness, but because their high emotional awareness makes them crave mutual understanding. They mistakenly believe that if they just find the right words, others will finally see their heart and intentions. True emotional intelligence, EQ, is not about managing or controlling other people's perceptions. It is about self-regulation. Shifting from external validation to internal grounding marks the birth of real psychological strength. When an empath stops explaining, it is not dynamic anger or passive aggression. It is a quiet, non-reactive boundary that protects inner peace and conserves vital mental energy. An empath achieves silent power the moment they accept that understanding cannot be forced. You are responsible for your clarity and integrity, but never for another person's capacity or willingness to comprehend you. Moving away from defense and justification alters the dynamics of any relationship. By withholding the energy that fuels conflict, the empath forces the surrounding environment to face its own internal noise. Over-explaining is one of the most subtle, pervasive traps that a highly sensitive, deeply empathetic individual can fall into, because on the surface, it looks like a virtue. It dresses itself up as kindness, clarity, and a sincere desire to resolve conflict. When you care deeply about people, your instinct is to make sure your heart is fully understood, and so when tension arises or a boundary is crossed, your immediate impulse is to talk it through. You offer context. You unpack your reasons, and you meticulously lay out your internal state so that no one misinterprets your intentions. But if we look beneath that impulse with psychological clarity, we see that over-explaining does not stem from strength or genuine connection. It stems from a deep-seated urge to soothe an activated nervous system. For an empath, emotional dissonance in their environment feels physically uncomfortable. Your elevated capacity for attunement means that you absorb the micro expressions, the subtle shifts in tone, and the unsaid judgments of those around you. When someone misunderstands you, misinterprets your motives, or reacts negatively to a boundary you have set, your brain flags that moment as a threat to psychological safety. The urge to explain becomes a frantic coping mechanism designed to restore balance and make the other person comfortable again, because you hold the false belief that their comfort is the precondition for your peace. You tell yourself that if you can just find the right combination of words, the exact sequence of rational arguments, or the most gentle phrasing, the other person will finally see your truth. You assume that the gap between you is merely a lack of information, and if you supply enough data, the gap will close. But this is where the trap snaps shut. In the vast majority of cases, over-explaining occurs in relationships with individuals who are either unable or unwilling to meet you with the same level of emotional depth. When you offer endless explanations to someone who is not operating with high emotional awareness, you are not building a bridge, you are handing them fuel for debate. You turn your valid feelings, your personal preferences, and your reasonable boundaries into open discussions subject to their approval. Every time you justify why you are tired, why you cannot attend an event, or why a certain behavior hurt you, you implicitly send a message to your own subconscious that your feelings are not valid on their own. You signal that your boundaries require third-party verification before they are allowed to exist. This creates a staggering drain on your cognitive and emotional energy. The mental bandwidth required to constantly anticipate how you will be perceived, to draft mental scripts before speaking, and to repair every slight misunderstanding is enormous. It leaves you feeling fundamentally exhausted, resentful, and alienated from your own authentic self. The realization that breaks this cycle is understanding that over-explaining is an attempt to control something that was never within your power to control: another person's mind. You can be the most articulate, compassionate communicator in the world, but you cannot force someone to comprehend a truth they are psychologically unequipped or unwilling to receive. True emotional strength begins when you stop viewing another person's misunderstanding as a problem you are obligated to solve. When you recognize that your truth does not require a defense, you finally break free from the exhausting cycle of justification, allowing your boundaries to rest securely on the quiet foundation of your own self-trust. The pivot to emotional regulation marks the profound transition from an outward-focused existence to an inward-anchored state of self-mastery. For many empaths, the majority of life is spent operating in a state of hypervigilance, where the primary psychological focus is outward. You are constantly monitoring the emotional climate of the room, tracking the subtle shifts in someone else's posture, measuring their satisfaction, and anticipating their reactions. In this reactive mode, your internal state is entirely dependent on external conditions. If the people around you are calm, validated, and pleased, you allow yourself to feel safe. If they are annoyed, confused, or defensive, your internal system immediately goes into damage control. This is the hallmark of emotional codependency masquerading as empathy. You mistake the ability to absorb and fix other people's emotions for emotional intelligence, when in reality, true emotional intelligence, EQ, requires the exact opposite. True emotional intelligence is fundamentally built upon self-regulation, the capacity to recognize your own internal emotional state and maintain stability regardless of the storm happening around you. The moment an empath undergoes this pivotal shift, their entire relational dynamic transforms. You begin to realize that your primary duty is not to manage, fix, or soothe the emotional states of those around you, but to govern your own. When someone reacts with anger, disappointment, or skepticism toward your choices or boundaries, a self-regulated individual does not rush in to fix their discomfort. You recognize that their emotional reaction belongs to them just as your internal peace belongs to you. Shifting from seeking external validation to cultivating internal grounding is the birth of real psychological strength. External validation is an unstable currency. If you rely on other people's approval to feel grounded, your self-worth will fluctuate with every changing mood and opinion of the people in your life. Internal grounding, however, means establishing a deep, quiet alignment with your own values, truth, and self-respect. It is the practice of sitting with the discomfort of being misunderstood, criticized, or disliked without rushing to defend yourself or change who you are to fix the moment. When you cultivate this level of internal grounding, you develop a strong psychological core. Your nervous system no longer interprets someone else's disapproval as an existential threat that requires immediate intervention. Instead of reacting reflexively, offering excuses, backing down on a boundary, or engaging in a heated argument, you are able to pause. In that pause lies your power. You observe the other person's reaction with compassion, but without taking ownership of it. You allow them to feel their disappointment, their anger, or their confusion, understanding that their struggle to process your boundary is a reflection of their emotional capacity, not your worth. This internal pivot fundamentally changes how you navigate conflict. When you no longer need the other person to agree with your boundary or validate your feelings for them to be real, the urge to manage their perception simply dissolves. You stop asking, "How can I make them understand?" and start asking, "How can I stay anchored in my own integrity right now?" This shift from external control to internal mastery is not an act of isolation or cold detachment. It is the ultimate expression of emotional self-respect, transforming empathy from a vulnerability that drains you into an authentic, calm power that protects your peace. To understand the true nature of silence when an empath steps into their power, one must first dismantle the misconception that quietness is merely a passive reaction. In many interpersonal dynamics, silence is weaponized as dynamic anger, stonewalling, or passive aggression, a calculated attempt to punish the other person, draw them into anxiety, or manipulate the outcome of a conflict. But when an emotionally intelligent empath chooses silence, it springs from a completely different psychological foundation. It is not a tactic to control someone else, nor is it a cold mechanism of revenge. It is a profound, non-reactive boundary designed solely to protect inner peace and conserve vital mental energy. For years, an empath's natural impulse in the face of tension or unfair treatment is to engage, to speak louder, to explain deeper, and to constantly extend their emotional energy across the divide in hopes of reaching a resolution. Yet, when this relentless output yields no real understanding, a vital shift occurs. The empath realizes that continuing to speak into an emotionally deaf environment is an act of self-depletion. Choosing to remain silent in these moments is not an admission of defeat or a surrender of truth. It is the quiet, firm recognition that your words are a valuable resource that should no longer be wasted on bad faith debates. This silence acts as a protective shield around your nervous system. Every time you engage in circular arguments, respond to subtle provocations, or attempt to defend your basic human boundaries against someone who refuses to respect them, you trigger a physiological cascade of stress within your own body. Your heart rate rises, cortisol floods your system, and your cognitive focus is hijacked by the need to prepare your next defense. By intentionally stepping back and withholding verbal re-engagement, You break that cycle instantly. You choose to keep your physiological state grounded rather than allowing another person's turbulence to dictate your internal weather. Furthermore, this form of silent power completely alters the flow of energy within a relationship. When you stop offering defensive explanations or reactive counterarguments, you remove the fuel that sustains toxic or one-sided dynamics. Conflict requires two active participants, and when one person quietly refuses to step into the ring of justification, the entire dynamic collapses under its own weight. Your silence acts as a mirror, reflecting the other person's behavior, words, and emotional reactivity directly back onto them without filtering it through your typical cushioning response. They are forced to sit in the quiet space created by your boundary, unable to use your reactions as a distraction from their own conduct. This transition requires immense self-discipline because the urge to speak up, set the record straight, or have the final word is deeply ingrained in high empathy individuals. It demands that you value your own psychological tranquility more than the fleeting satisfaction of proving a point. Silence, in this refined context, becomes the ultimate expression of emotional dignity. It is a clear declaration that your peace of mind is no longer up for negotiation, and that you respect yourself enough to walk away from battles that serve no purpose other than to drain your spirit. Releasing responsibility for how other people perceive you is perhaps the most liberating milestone in the evolution of an empathetic mind. For a long time, your primary operational assumption has been that if someone views you negatively, holds a grudge, or misunderstands your motives, it is a personal failing on your part that you are obligated to repair. You operate under the heavy, silent delusion that you are somehow accountable for the emotional weather of everyone around you. But achieving true, silent power requires an absolute, unshakable acceptance of a fundamental reality. You can never force another human being to understand a truth they are psychologically, emotionally, or intellectually unequipped to comprehend. Understanding is not merely a matter of giving someone clear information. It is a function of the receiver's capacity, self-awareness, personal biases, and willingness to look beyond their own ego. When an empath attempts to manage how others perceive them, they step into an endless, exhausting role where they are constantly editing their authenticity to fit into the limited mental frameworks of those around them. You end up shrinking your boundaries, diluting your truth, and over-explaining your choices just to ensure that no one misinterprets your heart as cruel or selfish. Yet, no matter how carefully you craft your words, an individual who views the world through a lens of defensive insecurity will always project their own issues onto your actions. A healthy boundary will be perceived by an emotionally immature person as a personal attack. A necessary step back for your own mental health will be labeled as abandonment. Your quiet self-respect will be misinterpreted as arrogance or hostility. The moment you grasp that their perception of you is a direct reflection of their internal state, their wounds, their conditioning, and their emotional limits, the burden of their opinion instantly falls off your shoulders. Your responsibility in any relationship extends only to the edge of your own behavior. You are responsible for speaking your truth with clarity, acting with basic human integrity, and maintaining clean, respectful intentions. Beyond that line, where your words cross into their mind and are filtered through their personal biases, your responsibility completely ends. You do not owe anyone an endless defense of your character, nor do you need to secure their permission to set a boundary that protects your well-being. Letting go of this burden does not mean you become cold, heartless, or indifferent to others. Rather, it means you gain the wisdom to distinguish between what is genuinely yours to carry and what belongs to someone else. It allows you to grant people the freedom to be wrong about you without feeling the panic-driven need to correct them. You realize that your value, your honor, and the purity of your heart do not rely on a unanimous vote of approval from the people in your life. When you allow others to hold whatever opinion of you they choose, you reclaim an immense amount of psychological energy that was once wasted on damage control. You step out of the exhausting role of manager of perceptions and step fully into the quiet, unbothered reality of your own self-trust, knowing that being true to yourself is infinitely more important than being accepted by those who are committed to misunderstanding you. The shift from reaction to presence is the definitive moment where an empath reclaims their personal power and reshapes the energetic landscape of their relationships. For a long time, your interactions with difficult or emotionally demanding people have likely been characterized by reactivity. Reactivity is an automatic, involuntary response to external stimuli. It is the immediate spike in your heart rate when someone speaks in a sharp tone, the instant urge to defend yourself when accused of something unfair, or the frantic effort to smooth over an uncomfortable silence. When you operate in a state of reactivity, you are essentially allowing the other person to dictate your internal state and control your behavior. You become a passive receiver of their turbulence, jumping to defend, explain, or appease whenever they throw an emotional curveball. But presence, deep, grounded, non-reactive presence, changes everything.
Presence is the conscious decision to step out of the ring of drama and anchor yourself firmly in your own body and mind. It is the ability to observe a situation without absorbing it, to feel the emotional charge in the room without letting it pull you out of your center. When you cultivate presence, you create a psychological space between the other person's stimulus and your response. And within that space lies your absolute freedom. Moving from defense and justification to quiet presence fundamentally alters the underlying dynamic of any interpersonal interaction. Conflict and manipulation thrive on momentum. They require a continuous exchange of reactive energy to keep burning. When someone approaches you with hostility, passive aggression, or unfair demands, they are often unconsciously seeking a specific reaction from you. They want your defense, your guilt, your anger, or your frantic over-explanation to validate their own narrative or fuel their argument. When you offer them quiet, grounded presence instead of defense, you effectively starve the conflict of its fuel. By withholding the reactive energy that usually sustains the cycle, you disrupt their expected pattern. You do not absorb their anger, nor do you hurl anger back. You simply remain still, like a massive tree standing firm in the middle of a passing storm. This non-reactive presence acts as a powerful psychological mirror. In the absence of your defensive noise, the surrounding environment is forced to face its own internal noise. The other person is left standing alone with their elevated voice, their unreasonable demands, and their emotional instability, completely unbuffered by your usual cushioning responses. They can no longer blame your reaction for the escalation of the argument, because you haven't given them one to hide behind. They are confronted directly with the reality of their own behavior. This transition requires immense internal discipline, because everything in your conditioned past urges you to speak up, to correct their misinterpretation, or to make the discomfort go away. Yet, as you practice holding your ground in quiet presence, you discover that true influence does not come from having the last word or winning an argument. It comes from being the most grounded, centered person in the room. You realize that your calm is far more contagious and powerful than their chaos, allowing you to walk through high-stress situations with complete emotional sovereignty.